Alright, so this is video over the week 3 homework, problem number 28. So it says here that we need to evaluate this expression. So we have negative 40 minus 8 times a negative 2 cubed times 6. So the first thing I want to remind us of, guys, is remember, if you have two values that are connected to one another without any sort of symbol in between them, remember that you always assume that that's multiplication. Sometimes you'll see it written with a dot. I usually will put a dot in here just because I think it's good to have some sort of symbol there just to make sure that we're all on the same page. But just remember, in the future, for quizzes, tests, other homework assignments, if you have two numbers sitting right next to one another and there's no symbol connecting them, no minus sign, no plus sign, no division, then you should assume that those numbers are being multiplied. Alright, so what we need to do to evaluate this, guys, is we need to make sure that we just go through our order of operations and take care of them in the proper order. Take care of evaluating all of the different operations that we have here. So in the order of operations, parentheses start first. So notice that we do have two values here in parentheses. We have a negative 2 and a 6. However, inside of those parentheses, we can't simplify any further, right? They are as simplified as they're going to get. So we move on to the next thing in our order of operations, which is our exponents. And notice that we do have an exponent here. So the first thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to raise the base of this exponent, which is negative 2, to the power of 3. So let's just go ahead and rewrite everything else. And I'm just going to go ahead and write this out. Alright, so remember that raising negative 2 to the third power means that you are going to take negative 2 and you're going to multiply it to itself 3 times. Right? The power tells us how many times to multiply the base to itself. So this base of negative 2 gets multiplied to itself 3 times. Right? Now that's not actually performing the power of 3 necessarily, so we still need to go through here and we need to multiply these 3 together. So rewriting everything and taking care of that, we're going to have negative 40 minus 8 times, so remember we had negative 2 to the third, which is negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. So negative 2 times negative 2 is a positive 4. Times negative 2 is a negative 8. And then we still have times 6. Okay, so I just threw in this extra step here, guys. If you would see this worked out in a textbook example or maybe done by someone else, you'll usually just jump straight to this step here. But I just want us to make sure, since it may have been a while since we've seen exponents, exactly what's happening here, right? You take your base and multiply it to itself this many times. So in this case, 3 times. So we've taken care of all parentheses. We have now taken care of all exponents. The next thing that we need to look at here is multiplication and division. And remember, if there are ties, meaning if you have different instances where you have multiplication or division, you always work from left to right. So we have a negative 40 minus 8. Right here is our first instance of multiplication. So we have this 8 times this negative 8. So this is going to be equal to, we have negative 40 minus 8 times negative 8. That is a negative 64. And then we still are multiplying this by 6. So we're not quite done with our multiplication and division step of our order of operations. We still have this multiplication here as well. So we have a negative 40 minus a negative 64 times 6. And just so I don't make any mistakes here, let's go ahead and use a calculator to multiply this out. So we have 64, a negative 64 times 6. So that's negative 384. So we have negative 40 minus, and we just saw that negative 64 times 6 is negative 384. Now, if you were looking through the discussion from last week a lot, hopefully you saw in all of the comments that one of the biggest takeaways that we need to remember about adding and subtracting negatives is that if you ever take away a negative value, if you subtract a negative, that is the same as adding the positive of that number. All right, so concentrating just on what I had written there in red, negative 40 minus a negative 384 is the exact same thing as negative 40 plus a positive 384. That's a very important takeaway and something that we should always remember. Subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. So what we have here is negative 40, and we are adding to it a positive 384. And we are left with 344 as our final answer. All right, so the big takeaway here, guys, that we need to remember, a couple of things really. Obviously, whenever you are dealing with your exponents, recall what you're doing is you are taking that base, the larger number, and by larger I don't mean larger in value, I mean larger in size, the larger number down lower, we call that the base, and multiplying it to itself the number of times you see in the power, the smaller number, the superscript up above that larger number. And then the other thing is that anytime you are subtracting a negative, anytime you are subtracting a negative, that's the same as adding a positive.